My name is Margaret Rose Carlisle, and at 73 years old, I've learned that some people mistake silver hair for a silver mind. They think wrinkles mean weakness, that age spots signal surrender. My stepson, Derek, thought exactly that. When he looked me in the eye 3 months ago and said, "Face it, Margaret, you're already in your grave. Just accept it gracefully." He was standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd made him birthday cakes for 25 years, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, treating me like an inconvenience that needed to be managed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Derek didn't know was that I'd been building something in the shadows for decades. While he was busy climbing corporate ladders and collecting trophies, I was quietly assembling an empire he never saw coming. Some graves are dug by others, but some you dig yourself and invite your enemies to fall into them. This is the story of how I proved that the only thing dead about me was my tolerance for disrespect. I was born Margaret Rose Sullivan in a 3-room apartment above my father's hardware store in Cedar Falls, Wisconsin in 1951. Money was scarce, but love was abundant. And I learned early that hard work and sharp thinking could overcome almost any obstacle. My mother died when I was 16, leaving me to help my father run the store while finishing high school. I graduated valedictorian not because I was the smartest girl in my class, but because I was the most determined. After high school, I moved to Milwaukee with $37 in my purse and a fierce desire to build something meaningful. I worked days as a receptionist at a small accounting firm and nights as a waitress at Romano's Italian restaurant. The accounting firm taught me about numbers, about how money moved and multiplied and disappeared when people weren't paying attention. Romano's taught me about people, about reading faces and understanding what motivates someone to spend their hard-earned cash on a night out. By 25, I'd saved enough to buy a tiny studio apartment in a neighborhood that polite people called up and coming, but honest people called rough. I didn't care about polite opinions. I cared about opportunity, and opportunity lived in places where other people were afraid to look. I started small, buying rundown properties with every penny I could scrape together, learning to fix them myself from YouTube videos and library books, then renting them to young professionals who appreciated clean, affordable housing in an uncertain economy. That's how I met Thomas Carlisle in 1982. He was a recently divorced insurance adjuster with a 12-year-old son named Derek, looking for a temporary rental while he got back on his feet. Thomas was 42 to my 31, with premature gray hair and kind eyes that had seen too much disappointment. He rented my basement apartment on Maple Street for 6 months, but we both knew from the first week that this arrangement would last much longer than either of us had planned. Thomas was everything I'd never known I wanted in a partner. He was steady where I was ambitious, cautious where I was bold, content where I was constantly reaching for more. He'd wake up early to make coffee before I left for my various jobs, would listen patiently as I explained my latest property investment schemes over dinner, never once suggesting that my dreams were too big for a woman from a hardware store in Cedar Falls. When I told him I wanted to expand beyond rental properties into commercial real estate, he nodded and asked how he could help. Derek was a different story entirely. At 12, he was already developing the entitled attitude that would define his entire relationship with the world. His mother had remarried a wealthy contractor in California and made it clear that Derek was his father's responsibility now. The boy resented being shuffled between houses, resented his father's modest income, resented the small apartment and second-hand clothes that came with living paycheck to paycheck. When Thomas and I married in 1984, Derek was 14 and furious. He'd convinced himself that his parents would eventually reconcile, that his mother would come to her senses and return to Wisconsin. My presence made that fantasy impossible, and he blamed me for destroying his carefully constructed delusion. At the wedding reception, held in the community room of my apartment building because it was all we could afford, Derek sat in the corner glaring at anyone who dared to smile. I tried everything to connect with that angry boy. I helped him with homework, attended his baseball games, bought him the name brand clothes he desperately wanted to fit in at school. When he complained that his friends had better bikes, I worked extra shifts at Romano's to buy him a top-of-the-line mountain bike for his 15th birthday. He rode it exactly once, then left it in the garage to rust because accepting my gifts felt like betraying his mother's memory of their former life. Thomas and I settled into a comfortable rhythm over the next few years. He handled the day-to-day management of my rental properties while maintaining his insurance job, and I focused on expanding our real estate portfolio. By 1987, we owned 6 rental units and were looking at our first commercial property, a small strip mall in a developing suburb that everyone said was too risky for a couple with modest means. Derek graduated high school with mediocre grades and an acceptance letter to the state university, paid for entirely by my real estate profits. He chose business administration not because he had any particular interest in business, but because he'd decided that making money was the only thing that mattered in life. He spent 4 years learning theory while I spent those same 4 years learning practice, adding 12 more rental units to our portfolio and successfully renovating that strip mall into a profitable venture. The day Derek graduated college, he announced that he'd accepted a position with a financial services firm in Chicago. He packed his belongings, shook his father's hand with formal politeness, and nodded at me with the same distant courtesy he'd show a helpful stranger. Thomas cried that night after Derek left, not because his son was moving away, but because they'd never really connected despite 22 years of trying. Derek called every few weeks, conversations that lasted exactly long enough to be considered dutiful. He sent Christmas cards with pre-printed messages and his business card tucked inside, as if we might need to contact his office to reach him. When he got promoted to senior analyst, we learned about it from a newspaper clipping his secretary mailed to us. When he bought his first condo, we heard about it 3 months later during one of his obligatory phone calls. Thomas retired from the insurance company in 1998, but we were far from finished building our empire. By then, I owned 37 rental units spread across Milwaukee's most promising neighborhoods, 3 commercial properties, and had quietly begun investing in small businesses that showed promise but lacked capital. I'd developed a reputation as someone who understood both numbers and people, who could spot potential where others saw only risk. My investment strategy was simple but effective. I looked for hardworking people with good ideas who'd been turned down by traditional banks because they didn't fit the standard profile of success. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A young woman who wanted to open a bakery in a former gas station. An immigrant family who planned to convert a rundown warehouse into affordable artist studios. A military veteran who dreamed of starting a home security business from his garage. I provided the capital, took a reasonable return, and watched as their success multiplied my own. Thomas loved this phase of our life together. He'd accompany me to ribbon cuttings and grand openings, beaming with pride as the business owners thanked me for believing in them when no one else would. We'd drive through the neighborhoods where our rental properties had helped young families get their start, past the strip malls where our commercial tenants were building their dreams, and Thomas would squeeze my hand and say, "Look what you built, Maggie." Look what we built together. Derek remained a distant figure in our lives, sending birth announcements when his children were born but never inviting us to visit, mentioning job changes and promotions in the same tone he might use to discuss the weather. He'd married a woman named Patricia, who worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company, and together they'd achieved the kind of suburban success that looked impressive on paper but felt hollow in practice. We met our grandchildren, Emma and Jacob, exactly 3 times in their first 10 years of life. Derek would fly into Milwaukee for Thomas's birthday or our anniversary, stay in a hotel despite our repeated invitations to use the guest room, and spend exactly 48 hours fulfilling his obligation as a son before returning to his real life in Chicago. During these brief visits, Derek would walk through our house with barely concealed amazement at what we'd accumulated. The artwork from local artists whose studios I'd helped finance, the handcrafted furniture from a woodworker whose shop rent I'd subsidized during his startup years, the Persian rugs I'd bought at estate sales and had professionally restored. He'd run his fingers along surfaces and calculate values, never asking about the stories behind the pieces, only mentally cataloging their worth. Thomas began showing signs of decline in 2015. Small things at first, forgetting appointments, struggling to balance the checkbook he'd managed flawlessly for decades, getting confused about which properties needed maintenance. I took him to specialists who used words like cognitive decline and early-stage dementia, with the gentle firmness of people who delivered bad news for a living. I became Thomas's caregiver while continuing to manage our business interests, a balancing act that required every ounce of strength and organizational skill I'd developed over 30 years of building our empire. I hired assistants to handle the day-to-day property management, streamlined our investments to focus on the most profitable ventures, and quietly began preparing for a future where I'd be making all the decisions alone. Derek's response to his father's diagnosis was characteristically detached. He sent a sympathy card with a handwritten note expressing his sorrow about the situation, as if dementia were something that had happened to us rather than something we were living through together. He increased his calls to once a week. Conversations, where he'd ask clinical questions about Thomas's condition and practical questions about our financial situation with equal emotional investment. Thomas died peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in March 2023. I'd been expecting it, preparing for it, dreading it for months, but the actual moment still felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. The man who'd been my partner, my anchor, my greatest supporter for 39 years was simply gone, leaving me alone in a house filled with memories and an empire built for two. The funeral was small but meaningful. Our tenants came, many of whom had become genuine friends over the years. The business owners I'd helped launch brought flowers and shared stories about how Thomas had encouraged their dreams alongside my investments. Derek flew in from Chicago with Patricia and the children, dressed in expensive black clothes that made them look like they were attending a networking event rather than mourning a family member. During the service, I watched Derek's face for any sign of genuine grief and saw only the polite expression of someone fulfilling a social obligation. When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to share memories of Thomas, Derek stood and delivered a 3-minute speech that sounded like it had been prepared by his corporate communications department, full of generic phrases about a life well lived and lasting legacy that could have applied to any deceased person. After the burial, Derek approached me with the same professional courtesy he'd use with a difficult client. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone successful men use when they're about to explain something to someone they consider intellectually inferior. "Patricia and I have been discussing your situation, and we're concerned about you managing all of this alone." I looked at this 47-year-old stranger who shared Thomas's eyes but none of his warmth, who'd benefited from my financial support throughout his life but had never once expressed gratitude, who was now standing in the funeral home parking lot, treating his father's death as a business opportunity. "My situation?" I repeated, my voice carefully neutral. Derek glanced around at the modest gathering of people who actually cared about Thomas, then back at me with barely concealed impatience. "The properties, the investments, all of it. It's too much for someone your age to handle effectively. Dad should have simplified things years ago instead of letting the portfolio get so complicated." Patricia stepped forward, her smile as artificial as her pearl necklace. "What Derek means is that we want to help you transition into a more manageable lifestyle. There are excellent senior communities in the Chicago area where you could be close to family, and we could handle the complicated business details so you don't have to worry about them." I understood then that this conversation had been planned, probably during their flight from Chicago, possibly during phone calls that had taken place while Thomas was still alive. They'd seen his death as an opportunity to access assets they'd been coveting from a distance, assuming that a 73-year-old widow would be grateful for their intervention in her overwhelming affairs. "That's very thoughtful," I said, my voice giving away nothing of what I was thinking. "But I'm not ready to make any major changes so soon after losing Thomas. I need time to grieve, to process, to figure out what comes next." Derek's expression shifted slightly, revealing the impatience he was trying to hide behind his concern. Of course. But Margaret, you have to be realistic. Managing rental properties is physically demanding. Dealing with tenants, maintenance issues, problem renters. It's not appropriate for someone in your situation." Someone in my situation? A 73-year-old woman who'd built a multi-million-dollar real estate empire from nothing, who understood every detail of every investment, who had relationships with tenants and business partners that had been cultivating for decades. But in Derek's mind, my age and gender automatically disqualified me from managing my own life's work. "I appreciate your concern," I said again, still maintaining my calm tone. "But I'm not making any decisions today. Today is about saying goodbye to your father." Derek exchanged a look with Patricia that I wasn't supposed to notice. A look that said they'd expected more cooperation and were slightly annoyed at my stubborn refusal to see reason. "Well," he said finally, "we'll be staying in town for a few more days to help with arrangements. Maybe we can revisit this conversation when you've had time to think things through." That evening, I sat alone in the house Thomas and I had shared for 39 years, surrounded by the physical evidence of our life together, but feeling his absence like a physical weight on my chest. I walked through rooms we'd painted together, past photographs of trips we'd taken, around furniture we'd chosen as a team, and felt the full impact of becoming singular after being plural for so long. But even through my grief, I could feel something else stirring. Derek's assumption that I was too old and fragile to manage my own affairs had awakened something that had been sleeping since my days of fixing properties, with nothing but YouTube videos and determination. I'd spent 40 years proving that people underestimated me at their own peril, and my stepson was about to learn that lesson the hard way. I made myself a cup of Thomas's favorite tea and settled into his reading chair with the portfolio files I kept in our home office. 37 rental properties worth approximately $12 million. 3 commercial properties valued at another $8 million. Investment stakes in 14 local businesses with a combined worth of roughly $6 million. Liquid assets and retirement accounts totaling another $4 million. In total, Thomas and I had built an empire worth approximately $30 million. All of it legally mine according to the will we'd updated just 6 months before his death. Derek knew about some of our holdings. The original rental properties, the strip mall, the more visible investments. But he had no idea about the scope of what we'd built together, the careful diversification that had protected us through multiple economic downturns, the network of relationships that made our portfolio more valuable than the sum of its parts. More importantly, Derek had no idea that I'd been preparing for exactly this situation since his father's diagnosis. I'd quietly transferred certain assets into structures that would be difficult to challenge, established relationships with legal and financial professionals who understood my long-term goals, and created contingency plans for every possible scenario, including family members who might try to interfere with my wishes. The next morning, Derek called to invite himself over for coffee and a serious conversation about the future. I agreed, suggesting 11 o'clock, which would give me time to prepare for what I suspected would be his opening salvo in a campaign to convince me to surrender control of my own life. He arrived precisely on time, dressed in a business suit despite the casual nature of our supposed family conversation. Patricia accompanied him, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested this wasn't going to be the informal chat Derek had described on the phone. I served coffee in the china Thomas had given me for our 20th anniversary, using the good silver spoons that had belonged to his mother, taking my time with the ritual while Derek shifted impatiently in his chair. "Margaret," he began once. I'd settled across from them at the kitchen table. "Patricia and I spent some time yesterday reviewing Dad's financial records, and we're even more concerned than we initially thought." I sipped my coffee and waited for him to continue, my expression politely interested. The complexity of the holdings, the number of separate accounts, the various business partnerships, it's a full-time job managing all of this properly. More than a full-time job, really. He pulled a folder from Patricia's portfolio and spread several documents across the table. "We've done some preliminary research into professional management companies that specialize in exactly this type of situation." I glanced at the papers, noting that they'd taken the initiative to contact management companies without consulting me, had gone so far as to request preliminary proposals for handling my affairs. The presumption was breathtaking, but I kept my expression neutral. Patricia leaned forward with her practiced smile. "The wonderful thing about these companies is that they handle all the day-to-day stress, while ensuring that you receive a steady, reliable income without any of the headaches. You could finally relax and enjoy your golden years instead of worrying about tenant complaints and maintenance emergencies." Derek nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. And from a practical standpoint, it protects the assets from potential mistakes. That might happen if someone without current business experience is making decisions about complex investments." Someone without current business experience? As if the 30 years I'd spent building this empire had been some kind of hobby rather than a carefully executed business strategy. As if the success we'd achieved had been luck rather than skill and hard work. "These are interesting options," I said carefully, still not revealing my thoughts. "What kind of fees do these management companies typically charge?" Derek's relief at what he interpreted as my cooperation was visible. "Usually between 2 and 3% annually, which is quite reasonable considering the level of professional oversight they provide. 2 to 3% of $30 million meant they were proposing that I pay between $600,000 and $900,000 per year for the privilege of having strangers manage the empire I'd built with my own hands." The math was staggering. But what was even more staggering was Derek's assumption that I was too stupid to calculate it myself. "And what role would you and Patricia play in this arrangement?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Derek and Patricia exchanged another one of their meaningful looks. "Well," Derek said slowly, "given that we're family and given Patricia's background in business management, we thought it would make sense for us to serve as liaisons between you and the management company to ensure your interests are being properly represented." Liaison, a beautifully neutral word for what they were actually proposing, which was inserting themselves between me and my own assets, presumably for a fee that would make their involvement quite profitable. They'd done their homework, identified management companies, calculated potential returns, and positioned themselves to profit from my supposed incapacity. "This is certainly thorough," I said, gathering the papers they'd spread across my kitchen table. "You've obviously put a lot of thought into my situation." Derek's smile was the same one he'd used as a child when he thought he'd gotten away with something. "We just want what's best for you, Margaret. Dad would have wanted us to take care of you." The invocation of Thomas's wishes was the final insult. The man who'd spent 39 years watching me build something extraordinary from nothing, who'd supported every risk I'd taken and celebrated every success I'd achieved, who'd trusted me completely with every major decision in our life together. That man would have wanted his son to strip me of control over my own assets because I was too old to manage them properly. "I need some time to consider all of this," I said, standing to signal that our conversation was over. "It's a big decision, and I don't want to rush into anything." Derek's smile faltered slightly. He'd clearly expected more enthusiasm for his generous offer to manage my life. "Of course," he said, though his tone suggested that he thought I was being unnecessarily cautious. "But, Margaret, you should know that the longer you wait, the more risk you're exposing yourself to. These properties require constant attention, and if something major goes wrong..." He let the threat hang in the air, the implication that disaster was inevitable if I continued trying to handle things on my own. Patricia nodded sympathetically, as if she truly cared about my welfare, rather than the percentage she'd undoubtedly negotiated for herself in this scheme. After they left, I sat in my kitchen staring at the papers they'd left behind, marveling at the audacity of people who thought that age automatically equals incompetence, that gender automatically equals helplessness, that grief automatically equals vulnerability. They'd mistaken my politeness for weakness, my consideration for confusion, my measured response for inability to grasp the situation. What Derek didn't know was that I'd been dealing with people who underestimated me my entire life. Real estate agents who'd tried to steer me toward more appropriate properties when I was starting out. Contractors who'd quoted me inflated prices assuming I wouldn't know better. Tenants who'd tried to intimidate me into accepting lower rent or deferring necessary repairs. I'd learned long ago that the best response to such assumptions was not anger, but strategy. That afternoon, I made the first of several phone calls that would begin the process of teaching Derek the difference between being old and being foolish. My first call was to Elena Rodriguez, the attorney who'd been handling our legal affairs for the past 15 years. Elena was 52, brilliant, and had a particular talent for creating legal structures that protected her clients' interests while giving them maximum flexibility. She'd helped me navigate everything from complex property acquisitions to business partnership agreements, and she understood both my business philosophy and my personal values. "Margaret," Elena said when her secretary connected the call, "I'm so sorry about Thomas. How are you holding up?" "I'm managing," I replied, "but I'm calling because I have a family situation that requires some creative legal thinking." I explained Derek's visit, his assumptions about my capacity, and his obvious intention to position himself as my financial guardian, whether I wanted one or not. Elena listened without interruption, occasionally making notes until I finished describing the morning's conversation. "So," she said finally, "your stepson believes you're too old to manage your own affairs and has generously offered to solve this problem by inserting himself into your financial life as a paid intermediary. That's a very succinct summary of the situation." Elena laughed, a sound that held no humor. "Margaret, I've been working with you for 15 years. I've watched you navigate deals that would challenge someone half your age. I've seen you outmaneuver opponents who thought they could take advantage of what they perceived as your weaknesses. If Derek thinks you're an easy target, he's about to get a very expensive education in the difference between seeming vulnerable and actually being vulnerable." My second call was to David Chen, the financial advisor who'd been helping me structure my more complex investments for the past decade. David was 38, held advanced degrees in both finance and business, law, and had built his practice by serving clients who didn't fit the traditional wealth management model. He understood that my portfolio was about more than maximizing returns. It was about creating sustainable value while supporting the community that had supported me. "Mrs. Carlisle," David said when I reached him at his office, "please accept my condolences on Mr. Carlisle's passing. He was a remarkable man." "Thank you, David. I'm calling because I need to discuss some changes to my financial structure, and I need them implemented quickly and quietly." I outlined my situation with Derek, emphasizing that while I had no intention of surrendering control of my assets, I wanted to create some additional layers of protection that would make any future challenges more difficult and expensive for potential opponents. David was quiet for several minutes after I finished explaining. "Mrs. Carlisle," he said finally, Are you asking me to help you create a structure that would make it legally and financially difficult for your stepson to interfere with your assets even if he somehow gained legal standing to do so? That's exactly what I'm asking. Then we should meet in person as soon as possible. This kind of planning requires careful coordination between legal and financial strategies, and we'll want Elena involved from the beginning. My third call was to Marcus Thompson, the private investigator I'd used twice in the past to verify the backgrounds of potential business partners. Marcus was a former police detective who'd opened his own agency specializing in corporate and financial investigations. He was thorough, discreet, and had a particular talent for uncovering information that people thought they'd kept hidden. "Margaret," Marcus said when I reached him, "I heard about Thomas. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Marcus. I need some information about my stepson Derek Carlisle and his wife Patricia. I want to know about their financial situation, their business dealings, anything that might explain why they're suddenly so interested in my welfare." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Are you expecting to find something specific?" "I'm expecting to find that their concern for my well-being is motivated by their concern for their own financial situation. But I want facts, not suspicions." Steady income meant accepting whatever returns the management company decided were appropriate, while paying them handsomely for the privilege of making my money work less effectively. "That's certainly an interesting perspective," I said. "I'll give it serious consideration." Derek's relief was audible. "I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this, Margaret. I know it's hard to admit when you need help, but this is really the best solution for everyone." After I hung up, I sat in Thomas's chair and thought about that phrase, being reasonable. Throughout my life, being reasonable had meant accepting other people's limitations on what I could achieve, what I deserved, what was appropriate for someone like me. Being reasonable had meant not challenging assumptions, not taking risks, not demanding more than others thought I should want. I'd spent 73 years learning that the difference between being reasonable and being successful was the willingness to ignore other people's definitions of what was possible. Derek thought I was already in my grave, that age had buried my ambition and capacity for strategic thinking. He was about to learn that the only thing I'd buried was my patience for people who mistook kindness for weakness. The war he'd started with his assumptions about my capabilities was about to begin in earnest, and I had advantages he couldn't imagine, and resources he'd never bothered to understand. Some battles are won with force, but the most satisfying victories come from allowing your opponents to defeat themselves through their own arrogance and miscalculation. Derek had just made the first of what would prove to be many very expensive mistakes. The meeting with Elena Rodriguez took place in her downtown office 3 days after Derek's phone call about being reasonable. Elena's law firm occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian building, and her corner office overlooked the Milwaukee River, where barges moved slowly through the autumn morning carrying grain and steel to destinations unknown. I arrived 15 minutes early, as was my habit, and spent the time watching the river traffic while organizing my thoughts. Elena entered precisely at our scheduled time, carrying a thick file and wearing the expression of someone who'd spent considerable time preparing for our conversation. At 52, she moved with the confident efficiency of a woman who'd learned to command respect in rooms full of men who initially underestimated her capabilities. We understood each other on that level, she and I, both having spent decades, proving that competence had nothing to do with gender or age. "Margaret," she said, settling behind her mahogany desk and opening the file. "I've been thinking about your situation since we spoke, and I want to make sure I understand exactly what you're facing before we discuss solutions." I appreciated Elena's directness. Too many professionals, especially when dealing with elderly clients, felt compelled to soften their language and cushion difficult truths with unnecessary gentleness. Elena had always spoken to me as an equal, which was one of many reasons I trusted her judgment implicitly. Derek believes I'm no longer capable of managing my own affairs, I said without preamble. He's positioning himself and his wife as my protectors while simultaneously arranging to profit from my supposed incompetence. I want to ensure that he can never successfully challenge my decisions or gain any control over assets I've spent a lifetime building. Elena nodded, making notes as I spoke. Have you given him any reason to believe you're experiencing cognitive decline or making poor financial decisions? None whatsoever. My most recent physical and cognitive assessments were excellent. My portfolio performance has been consistently strong, and I've made no changes to my investment strategy since Thomas's death. Derek's concerns are based entirely on my age and his assumption that widowhood equals helplessness. And his financial situation? Elena asked, though I suspected she already knew the answer based on the private investigator's preliminary report I'd received that morning. That's where things become interesting, I replied, pulling Marcus Thompson's initial findings from my purse. Derek and Patricia are significantly more leveraged than they've led anyone to believe. I handed Elena the summary Marcus had prepared, watching her eyebrows rise as she reviewed the information. Derek's financial consulting firm was struggling, with client defections and regulatory challenges that had reduced his income by nearly 60% over the past 2 years. Patricia's marketing career had ended abruptly when her pharmaceutical company had been acquired, and her entire department eliminated. Their Chicago condo carried a mortgage that consumed 40% of Derek's reduced income, and they'd accumulated credit card debt approaching $200,000 while maintaining their affluent lifestyle. So their sudden concern for your welfare coincides perfectly with their own financial crisis, Elena observed. How convenient. It gets more interesting, I continued. Marcus discovered that Derek has been telling colleagues and friends that he expects to inherit significant assets from his stepmother's estate. He's apparently been using these expectations as collateral for some of his financial decisions. Elena set down the report and leaned back in her chair. Margaret, this changes the legal landscape significantly. If Derek has been making financial commitments based on anticipated inheritance, he may be more desperate than you initially realized. Desperate people make dangerous opponents because they have less to lose. I'd reached the same conclusion myself after reading Marcus's full report. Derek wasn't simply greedy or opportunistic. He was in serious financial trouble and had convinced himself that my assets represented his salvation. People in that situation often escalated their tactics when their initial approaches failed, and I needed to be prepared for increasingly aggressive challenges to my autonomy. What options do we have for protecting my interests? I asked. Elena opened a different file and spread several documents across her desk. I've been researching protective strategies since our phone conversation, and I believe we can create a structure that would make it extremely difficult and expensive for Derek to challenge your decisions, even if he somehow convinced a court that you needed a guardian. She explained her recommendations systematically, starting with a comprehensive review and update of my existing estate planning documents. We would create new wills, trusts, and powers of attorney that explicitly addressed the possibility of family challenges and included specific language about my mental capacity and decision-making abilities. The key, Elena explained, is to establish a clear documentary record of your competence and intentions while you're unquestionably capable of making these decisions. We want multiple professional assessments of your cognitive function, detailed explanations of your investment philosophy and business strategies, and explicit statements about your relationship with Derek and your reasons for excluding him from any management role. I'll start with public records and work from there. How quickly do you need this information? Yesterday would be ideal, next week at the latest. By the time I finished these calls, it was nearly evening. I made myself dinner, Thomas's favorite pasta dish, and ate it while looking through the photo albums that chronicled our life together. Pictures of us at property closings, ribbon cuttings, anniversary dinners, business conferences. evidence of a partnership that had created something meaningful and lasting. Derek had made the mistake of assuming that Thomas had been the brains of our operation while I'd been merely a supportive spouse. The truth was more complex and more impressive than he could imagine. Thomas had been my anchor and my conscience, the person who kept me grounded while I reached for increasingly ambitious goals. But the vision, the strategy, the relentless drive to build something extraordinary that had been mine from the beginning. As I prepared for bed in the house that felt too quiet without Thomas's presence, I thought about the choices that lay ahead. I could accept Derek's proposal, surrender control of my life's work to management companies that would charge me enormous fees for the privilege of handling what I'd been handling successfully for 30 years. I could spend my remaining years as a wealthy but powerless old woman, dependent on the goodwill of professionals who saw me as a source of income rather than a person with her own goals and values. Or I could remind Derek and anyone else who might be watching that underestimating Margaret Rose Carlisle had always been a mistake that carried serious consequences. The next morning brought rain and a phone call from Derek that confirmed he'd interpreted my measured response as weakness rather than strategy. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying the false cheerfulness of someone who believed he was close to achieving his goal. "Patricia and I have been doing more research, and we found a management company that specializes in exactly your type of portfolio. They're willing to meet with us this afternoon to discuss transition options. They're willing to meet with us." As if Derek had become my official representative without my knowledge or consent. As if decisions about my future were now joint decisions that required his approval. "That's very thoughtful," I replied, my voice giving away nothing. "But I haven't agreed to any management changes yet. I'm still considering my options." The pause on Derek's end of the line lasted just long enough to reveal his growing impatience with my failure to recognize his superior wisdom. "Margaret," he said finally, his tone shifting from cheerful to condescending. "I understand that change is difficult, especially at your age, but you have to be realistic about your capabilities. Dad's gone now, and you can't keep pretending that you can handle all of this alone. Your age, your capabilities, you can't keep pretending." Each phrase was carefully chosen to reinforce his belief that I was too old, too female, too widowed to manage my own life. Derek had decided that my refusal to immediately embrace his proposal was evidence of my declining mental capacity, rather than my reasonable desire to maintain control over assets I'd spent a lifetime building. "I'm not pretending anything," I said, my voice still calm, but with an edge that Derek was too arrogant to recognize. "I'm making careful decisions about my future, just as I've been making careful decisions about my finances for 30 years. Derek laughed, a sound that managed to be both dismissive and pitying. "Margaret, with all due respect, 30 years ago, you were younger and Dad was there to help you. The world has changed, business has become more complex, and honestly, some of the investment choices you've made recently show questionable judgment. Questionable judgment." I thought about the 14 local businesses I'd helped launch, 11 of which had not only survived but thrived, creating jobs and contributing to the community while generating healthy returns on my investments. I thought about the rental properties I'd bought in neighborhoods that other investors had written off, properties that had appreciated significantly while providing affordable housing to working families. I thought about the commercial properties I'd acquired and improved, creating value while supporting local entrepreneurs. But Derek saw only an old woman making decisions he didn't understand, in markets he'd never studied, with goals that didn't match his narrow definition of financial success. "What investment choices concern you?" I asked, genuinely curious about which of my successful strategies he found problematic. "Well," Derek said, clearly relieved that I was finally asking for his expertise. "This business about investing in local startups, for instance. It's extremely high risk, and at your stage of life, you should be focused on capital preservation, not speculation." Capital preservation. the phrase that financial advisors used when they wanted elderly clients to accept lower returns in exchange for the illusion of safety. Derek wanted me to stop investing in the businesses that were revitalizing Milwaukee's economy and instead put my money in bonds and CDs that would barely keep pace with inflation. And some of these rental properties are in neighborhoods that are frankly marginal, he continued, warming to his theme. You'd be better off selling them and investing in blue-chip stocks or real estate investment trusts that don't require hands-on management. Marginal neighborhoods, areas where working families could afford to live, where young professionals were starting their careers, where immigrants were building new lives. Derek wanted me to abandon the communities that had supported my success in favor of abstract investments that would generate profits for distant shareholders. I see, I said. And you believe a management company would make these changes? Absolutely. They'd restructure everything for maximum efficiency and minimum risk. You'd have a steady income without any of the stress of dealing with problem tenants or maintenance emergencies. Maximum efficiency meant extracting every possible dollar from tenants while spending as little as possible on improvements or maintenance. Minimum risk meant abandoning any investment that couldn't be easily understood by people who'd never built anything themselves. The second component involved restructuring some of my assets to make them more difficult to access or challenge. Elena recommended creating an irrevocable trust that would hold my most valuable properties and investments, with myself as the primary beneficiary, but with professional trustees who could step in if I ever became truly incapacitated. The beauty of this structure, she said, is that it protects your assets from potential creditors or legal challenges while maintaining your control over investment decisions and income distribution. If Derek tries to have you declared incompetent, he'd have to convince a court to override not just your personal decisions, but also the professional judgment of qualified trustees. The third element was what Elena called defensive documentation. We would create detailed records of every aspect of my business operations, including property valuations, tenant relationships, investment performance, and financial decision-making processes. If Derek ever challenged my competence, we'd be able to demonstrate that my management had been consistently successful and professionally executed. Finally, Elena said, we need to consider the possibility that Derek might attempt more direct interference with your business operations. If he becomes desperate enough, he might try to contact your tenants, business partners, or financial institutions with claims that you're no longer competent to manage your affairs. This was a possibility I hadn't fully considered, but it made perfect sense given Derek's increasingly aggressive approach. If he couldn't convince me to surrender control voluntarily, he might try to create chaos in my business relationships that would force me to accept his assistance. Can we prevent that kind of interference? I asked. We can make it legally dangerous for him to try, Elena replied. I'll draft letters to your key business contacts explaining that any communications from Derek should be directed to this office, and that he has no authority to speak on your behalf regarding any aspect of your business or personal affairs. If he ignores those warnings, we can pursue harassment and interference claims that would be both financially and professionally damaging. I left Elena's office feeling more confident about my legal position, but increasingly concerned about the scope of Derek's potential desperation. If his financial situation was as precarious as Marcus's investigation suggested, he might be willing to take risks that a more stable person would avoid. My next stop was David Chen's financial advisory office, located in a modern building near the university where many of Milwaukee's emerging technology companies had established their headquarters. David's client base reflected his unconventional approach to wealth management. His waiting room was filled with young entrepreneurs, immigrant, business owners, and established professionals who valued innovation over tradition. David greeted me personally, as he always did, and led me to his private office where the walls displayed photographs of client businesses he'd helped launch or expand. I recognized several of the companies from my own investment portfolio, businesses where David's financial guidance and my capital had combined to create substantial success stories. "Mrs. Carlisle," he said once we were seated, "I've been reviewing your accounts since we spoke, and I want to discuss some immediate protective measures before we address longer-term structural changes." David explained that Derek's position as my stepson could potentially give him standing to request information about my financial affairs from certain institutions, especially if he claimed to be concerned about elder abuse or financial exploitation. While such requests would ultimately be denied without proper legal authority, the process of challenging them could create disruption and unwanted scrutiny. "I recommend that we immediately implement additional security protocols on all your accounts," David said. "New passwords, additional verification requirements, and explicit instructions that no information should be shared with anyone except you personally or Elena as your designated attorney." He also suggested that we accelerate some planned portfolio adjustments that would move assets into structures that would be more difficult for outsiders to monitor or challenge. Several of my business investments could be consolidated into a limited liability company that would provide both operational efficiency and additional privacy protection. "The goal," David explained, "is to create enough complexity and legal protection that anyone trying to interfere with your finances would need substantial resources and professional assistance. Most people, even those with significant motivation, will back down when they realize how expensive and difficult the process would be." We spent the next 2 hours reviewing every aspect of my financial structure, identifying potential vulnerabilities, and implementing protective measures. David's thoroughness was impressive. He considered possibilities that hadn't occurred to me and suggested solutions that addressed problems I didn't know I had. As we concluded our meeting, David asked a question that had been troubling me since my conversation with Derek. "Mrs. Carlisle, have you considered the possibility that Derek might try to involve other family members or friends in his campaign to convince you that you need help managing your affairs?" I hadn't thought about that angle, but it made perfect sense. Derek could potentially recruit allies by expressing concern about my welfare, painting himself as a dutiful son worried about an aging parent who was too proud to accept help. Such campaigns could be particularly effective with people who didn't know me well enough to recognize the absurdity of his claims. "Who might he approach?" I asked. "Patricia's family, mutual friends from Chicago, perhaps even some of your local acquaintances who might be sympathetic to his stated concerns about your welfare. If he can create a narrative that portrays you as isolated and stubborn, he might be able to generate enough outside pressure to make you question your own judgment." This was exactly the kind of manipulation I'd expect from someone with Derek's background in financial services, where managing client perceptions was often as important as managing their money. He understood how to present information in ways that supported his desired conclusions, and he'd have no qualms about using those skills against me. "How do we counter that kind of campaign?" I asked. David smiled. "We make sure that the people who matter most have accurate information about your situation before Derek can contaminate their perceptions with his version of events." That afternoon, I began what would become an extensive outreach campaign to the professional and personal relationships that formed the foundation of my business and social life. I started with phone calls to my closest friends, women I'd known for decades who understood my capabilities and would immediately recognize the absurdity of Derek's claims about my declining competence. My first call was to Helen Morrison, my closest friend since our children were in elementary school together. Helen was 71, a retired school principal who had maintained her sharp intellect and independent spirit despite losing her husband 5 years earlier. She would understand both the practical and emotional aspects of my situation with Derek. "Margaret," Helen said when she answered, "I've been thinking about you constantly since Thomas's funeral. How are you managing?" "I'm doing well, Helen, but I'm calling because I need to share something important with you." I explained Derek's behavior since the funeral, his assumptions about my capabilities, and his obvious intention to insert himself into my financial affairs. Helen's response was immediate and satisfying. "That arrogant little weasel," she said with the directness that had made her an effective principal for 30 years. I remember when he used to visit during high school, acting like he was too good for Millfield and everyone in it. Now he thinks he can swoop in and take over your life? I'm concerned that he might contact our mutual friends with claims that... I'm not thinking clearly, I said. I want people to hear my side of the story before they hear his version. Margaret, anyone who's known you for more than 5 minutes would laugh at the suggestion that you can't manage your own affairs. But you're right to be proactive about this. Derek always was the type to charm people who didn't know him well. I made similar calls to 6 other close friends, women who had witnessed my business acumen firsthand and would serve as credible witnesses to my competence if Derek tried to challenge it publicly. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. Initial outrage at Derek's presumption, followed by offers of support and assistance if I needed anything. My next series of calls went to key business contacts. The property management company that handled day-to-day operations for my rental units, the contractors who maintained my commercial properties, the accountant who prepared my tax returns, and the insurance agents who covered my various holdings. I explained that my stepson might attempt to contact them with claims about my mental state, and I asked them to direct any such inquiries to Elena's law office. The response from these business contacts was uniformly supportive and professionally reassuring. These were people who dealt with me regularly, who had seen my decision-making process in action, who understood the complexity and success of my operations. The idea that I was suffering from age-related decline was not only obviously false, but potentially insulting to their own professional judgment in continuing to work with me. By evening, I had spoken with 23 people who formed the core of my professional and personal network. Each conversation had reinforced my confidence in my position, while creating a web of informed allies who would be able to counter Derek's narrative if he attempted to spread it. The next morning brought a phone call that confirmed my suspicions about Derek's escalating tactics. The call came from Jennifer Walsh, the property manager who oversaw 12 of my rental units in the downtown area. "Mrs. Carlisle," Jennifer said, her voice carrying a note of confusion. "I received a strange call yesterday from someone claiming to be your stepson. He was asking about property operations and seemed to be suggesting that you might not be capable of making decisions about the buildings anymore." My pulse quickened, but I kept my voice calm. What exactly did he say? He introduced himself as Derek Carlisle and said he was calling because the family was concerned about your ability to manage your properties effectively. He asked about tenant complaints, maintenance issues, vacancy rates, that sort of thing. When I told him that all property information was confidential and that I only discuss business matters with you directly, he became quite insistent. Insistent? How? Jennifer paused. He suggested that I might be putting myself at legal risk by following the instructions of someone who wasn't mentally competent to give them. He said the family was prepared to take action to protect your interests, and that cooperating with them now would be better than waiting for court involvement later. The audacity of Derek's approach was breathtaking. He was threatening my business relationships with legal action if they didn't cooperate with his unauthorized investigation into my affairs. This wasn't just presumptuous. It was potentially criminal harassment and interference with my business operations. "Jennifer," I said, "I want you to document that conversation in writing and send a copy to my attorney. Derek has no authority to speak on my behalf about any aspect of my business or personal affairs. If he contacts you again, please direct him to Elena Rodriguez's law office and refuse to discuss anything else with him." Of course, Mrs. Carlisle. I have to say, I was shocked by his approach. Anyone who's worked with you knows how sharp and organized you are. The suggestion that you're not competent to manage your own affairs is ridiculous. After I hung up with Jennifer, I called Elena immediately to report Derek's contact with my property manager. Elena's response was swift and decisive. This is exactly what we anticipated, she said. Derek is testing the boundaries to see how far he can push before encountering serious resistance. I'll draft a cease and desist letter today demanding that he stop interfering with your business relationships. Will that be effective? It will establish a legal record of his inappropriate behavior and warn him that continued interference will result in formal legal action. If he ignores the warning, we'll have grounds for harassment and business interference claims that could result in significant financial penalties. Elena paused. Margaret, I think we need to accelerate our defensive preparations. Derek's willingness to contact your business associates suggests he's more desperate than we initially realized. Desperate people often escalate their tactics when their initial approaches fail. That afternoon, I received 2 more calls reporting similar contacts from Derek. The first came from Robert Kim, the contractor who handled major maintenance work on my commercial properties. Derek had called claiming to be conducting a family review of my business operations and asking for detailed information about upcoming projects and expenses. The second call came from Patricia Gonzalez, my accountant for the past 8 years. Derek had contacted her office requesting copies of my tax returns and financial statements, claiming that the family needed them for estate planning purposes following Thomas's death. Both Robert and Patricia had refused Derek's requests and directed him to contact me directly, but the pattern of his outreach was becoming clear. He was systematically attempting to gather information about my financial affairs, while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt about my competence with people who had professional relationships with me. Elena's cease and desist letter was delivered to Derek's Chicago office by courier that same day. The letter was comprehensive and legally intimidating, demanding that he immediately stop all unauthorized contact with my business associates, cease making any representations about my mental capacity or his authority to act on my behalf, and directing all future communications through Elena's law office. The letter also warned Derek that his recent actions constituted harassment and interference with my business operations, and that continued behavior of this type would result in formal legal action seeking both monetary damages and restraining orders that could affect his professional standing in the financial services industry. Derek's response came within hours, not through Elena's office as the letter had specified, but through a direct phone call to my home that evening. His tone had shifted from condescending concern to barely controlled anger. "Margaret," he said, without preamble when I answered, "What the hell do you think you're doing sending lawyers after me? I'm trying to help you, and you're treating me like some kind of criminal." I'd been expecting this call since Elena sent the letter, and I'd prepared for it carefully. "Derek," I replied calmly, "the letter simply asked you to stop interfering with my business relationships. If you haven't been doing anything inappropriate, it shouldn't concern you." "Inappropriate?" His voice rose. "I'm trying to protect you from making mistakes that could cost you everything you and Dad built together. Do you have any idea how vulnerable you are right now?" The phrase, "you and Dad built together," was particularly galling. Derek had never shown any interest in what Thomas and I had accomplished until he decided it could solve his financial problems. His sudden concern for preserving our legacy was entirely self-serving. "I'm not vulnerable at all," I said. "I'm a competent adult making informed decisions about my own affairs. Your interference with my business relationships is unwelcome and potentially illegal." Derek was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed to something more calculating. "Margaret, I don't think you understand the seriousness of your situation. Patricia and I have been doing research, and we've discovered some very concerning things about your recent financial decisions, such as the investment in that artist studio complex, for instance. You put $200,000 into a project that any competent financial advisor would have identified as extremely high risk. The immigrant family you're backing has no credit history, no business experience, and no realistic plan for profitability. I thought about the Ramirez family's artist studio project, one of my most recent investments, Eduardo and Maria Ramirez had spent 15 years building successful careers as artists while working various jobs to support their family. They'd approached me with a detailed business plan for converting a former textile warehouse into affordable studio spaces for emerging artists, complete with community workshop areas and retail space for selling artwork. I'd visited their current studios, reviewed their financial projections, and interviewed several of the artists who had committed to renting space in the new facility. The project addressed a real need in Milwaukee's growing arts community, while offering reasonable returns on investment and the potential for significant community impact. But Derek saw only numbers on a spreadsheet and risk factors that didn't fit his conservative investment philosophy. He couldn't understand investments that valued community development alongside financial returns, couldn't appreciate the long-term benefits of supporting local entrepreneurs who brought energy and innovation to neglected neighborhoods. The Ramirez project is thoroughly researched and carefully structured, I said. It addresses an underserved market while supporting a family with demonstrated artistic talent and business acumen. Derek laughed dismissively. Margaret, that's exactly the kind of emotional decision-making that proves you need professional management. Successful investing requires objectivity, not sentiment about supporting worthy causes. Emotional decision-making. As if 30 years of successful investments had been based on feelings rather than careful analysis and strategic thinking. As if my track record of identifying undervalued opportunities and supporting them to profitability was somehow less valid than Derek's theoretical knowledge gained from business school textbooks and corporate training programs. Derek, I said, my patience finally beginning to wear thin. My investment strategy has been consistently successful for 3 decades. I don't need your approval or your assistance in managing affairs that I understand better than you do. That attitude is exactly what worries me, Derek replied. You're so convinced that you know what you're doing that you can't recognize when you're making mistakes. Dad used to worry about this, you know. He told me he was concerned about some of your more speculative investments. The invocation of Thomas's supposed concerns was Derek's most manipulative tactic yet. My husband had been my strongest supporter and most trusted advisor throughout our marriage. He'd celebrated every success, offered gentle guidance during challenging decisions, and never once expressed doubt about my judgment or capabilities. Derek was attempting to rewrite history, to plant doubt about the foundation of trust and partnership that Thomas and I had built together. It was a particularly cruel form of gaslighting that relied on the fact that Thomas was no longer alive to contradict Derek's false claims about his feelings. Thomas never expressed any concerns about my investment decisions, I said firmly. He was proud of what we built together and confident in my ability to continue managing our affairs. Maybe he was too polite to say anything directly, Derek suggested. But he mentioned to me several times that he thought you were taking on too much risk, especially with these local business investments. He was worried about what would happen to you if some of these ventures failed. The conversation was becoming increasingly surreal. Derek was fabricating conversations with his father to support his claims about my poor judgment, apparently believing that I would doubt my own memories of 39 years of marriage based on his convenient recollections. Derek, I said, my voice taking on a coldness that he was apparently too obtuse to recognize. Your father and I discussed every major investment decision together. He never expressed concerns about my judgment, and he certainly never suggested that I needed outside management of our affairs. Look, Margaret, Derek said, shifting tactics again. I know this is difficult for you to accept. Nobody wants to admit that they're not as sharp as they used to be. But the evidence is right there in your recent decisions. The questionable investments, the refusal to modernize your portfolio, the emotional attachments to properties that should be sold for maximum return. Emotional attachments. Derek's characterization of my investment philosophy revealed everything about his own shallow understanding of long-term wealth building. He saw only immediate returns and abstract numbers, unable to comprehend that my success had been built on understanding people, communities, and the complex relationships between financial and social value. "Derek," I said, "this conversation is over. If you have any further concerns about my affairs, you can communicate them through Elena Rodriguez's office. Do not contact me directly, and do not contact any of my business associates again." "Margaret, wait." I hung up before he could finish his sentence. The conversation had confirmed everything I'd suspected about Derek's motivations and tactics. He was willing to lie about his father's concerns, fabricate evidence of my declining competence, and harass my business associates to achieve his goal of gaining control over my financial affairs. More importantly, his escalating aggression suggested that Elena had been right about his desperation. Derek wasn't simply opportunistic. He was in serious financial trouble and had convinced himself that my assets represented his only viable solution. That kind of desperation made him dangerous, but it also made him vulnerable to the kind of strategic response I was preparing. The next morning brought a call from Marcus Thompson with an update on his investigation into Derek's financial situation. The news was even more concerning than his initial report had suggested. "Margaret," Marcus said, "I've been digging deeper into Derek's finances, and the picture is quite troubling. He's not just over-leveraged. He's apparently been engaging in some questionable practices at his financial consulting firm." Marcus explained that Derek had been using his position to steer clients toward investment products that generated high commissions for him but poor returns for his clients. Several clients had withdrawn their accounts over the past year, and the firm was facing regulatory scrutiny that could result in significant fines and professional sanctions. "It gets worse," Marcus continued. "Derek has been telling people that he's expecting a substantial inheritance that will allow him to launch his own investment firm. He's apparently been using these claims to attract potential clients and business partners." The implications were staggering. Derek wasn't just hoping to benefit from my assets. He'd been actively marketing his access to my wealth as a business opportunity. He'd built financial commitments and professional relationships based on the assumption that he would soon control my affairs. "How much exposure does he have?" I asked. "Based on what I can determine from public records and professional contacts, Derek appears to be committed to financial obligations totaling somewhere between $3 and $5 million. If he can't deliver on his promises about the inheritance money, he could face both personal bankruptcy and professional disgrace." $5 million. Derek's financial desperation was even more severe than I'd realized, and his timeline for accessing my assets was probably much shorter than I'd anticipated. People facing that level of financial pressure often made increasingly reckless decisions as their situation deteriorated. "Marcus," I said, "I need you to expand your investigation. I want to know about every financial commitment Derek has made based on his claims about inheriting my assets. If this situation escalates to legal proceedings, I want comprehensive documentation of his motivation for trying to gain control of my affairs." That afternoon, I met with Elena and David together to discuss our accelerated response to Derek's increasingly desperate tactics. We convened in Elena's conference room, where the autumn sun streamed through tall windows overlooking the river that had carried commerce through Milwaukee for more than a century. Elena began by reviewing the legal implications of Derek's recent behavior. His contacts with my business associates constituted harassment and interference with my business operations, providing grounds for both civil lawsuits and potential criminal charges if his conduct continued to escalate. "More importantly," Elena said, "Derek's claims about expecting to inherit your assets could be used against him if he tries to challenge your competence in court. A judge would be very interested to learn that someone claiming to be concerned about your welfare has been making financial commitments based on gaining access to your money." David addressed the financial aspects of our defensive strategy. The protective structures we'd been implementing would make it extremely difficult for Derek to access my assets, even if he somehow succeeded in having me declared incompetent. The combination of irrevocable trusts, professional trustees, and complex ownership structures would require years of expensive litigation to challenge. The key, David explained, is that Derek doesn't have years to resolve his financial problems. If Marcus's investigation is accurate, Derek needs access to substantial funds within the next few months to avoid personal and professional collapse. Elena nodded. Which means he'll probably escalate his tactics significantly over the next few weeks. We need to be prepared for more aggressive challenges to Margaret's competence, possibly including attempts to involve social services or medical professionals in evaluating her mental state. We spent the next 2 hours developing a comprehensive response plan that would address every possible escalation of Derek's campaign against my autonomy. The plan included preemptive medical and cognitive evaluations that would establish my competence before Derek could request court-ordered assessments, detailed documentation of my business operations and decision-making processes, and a media strategy that would allow me to control the narrative if Derek tried to make his concerns public. Most importantly, we developed what Elena called the nuclear option, a comprehensive legal assault on Derek's finances and professional standing that would demonstrate the serious consequences of continuing his harassment campaign. If Derek pushes this to the point where we need to defend Margaret's competence in court, Elena explained, we won't just prove that she's capable of managing her own affairs. We'll systematically destroy Derek's credibility by exposing his financial desperation, his professional misconduct, and his obvious self-interest in gaining control of Margaret's assets. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since Thomas's death just 3 months earlier. I'd gone from being a widow grieving the loss of her life partner to being a woman preparing for war against her own stepson. The transformation felt both necessary and profoundly sad. Another loss to add to the devastating absence of Thomas's presence in my daily life. But there was something else emerging from the sadness, something I hadn't felt since the early days of building my business empire. The sharp focus and strategic clarity that came from facing a significant challenge with confidence in my ability to overcome it. Derek had awakened something in me that had been dormant during Thomas's illness and death, a fierce determination to protect what I'd built and prove that his assumptions about my declining capabilities were not just wrong, but dangerously naive. Derek thought I was already in my grave, finished and ready to surrender control of my life's work to his superior judgment. He was about to learn that some people become more dangerous when they're underestimated, and that the difference between being elderly and being helpless was a distinction he'd failed to understand at his own peril. The call came at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Elena had sent the cease and desist letter. The phone's shrill ring cut through the quiet of my kitchen where I sat with my coffee, watching the sunrise paint the sky above Milwaukee, in shades of gold and crimson. I recognized the number as Derek's, though I'd specifically instructed him to communicate only through Elena's office. "Margaret," his voice crackled with barely controlled panic. "We need to talk immediately. I'm driving up from Chicago this morning, and I'll be at your house by 10. The presumption was staggering. Derek was announcing his intention to invade my home without invitation, apparently believing that his crisis gave him the right to ignore my clearly stated boundaries. But there was something different in his tone this time, a raw desperation. That suggested his situation had deteriorated significantly since our last conversation. "Derek," I replied calmly, "I told you that all communication should go through Elena's office. I'm not meeting with you." "This isn't a request, Margaret. My business is collapsing because of your refusal to be reasonable about the inheritance situation. I've got clients demanding answers, partners threatening lawsuits, and creditors who won't wait any longer for promises about money that you're withholding out of spite." Withholding out of spite. Derek's characterization of my refusal to surrender my assets to his management revealed everything about his fundamental misunderstanding of our relationship. In his mind, my money had always belonged to him by right, and my insistence on maintaining control was a personal attack rather than a reasonable exercise of my own autonomy. "Derek," I said, "there is no inheritance situation. These are my assets, built with my labor and judgment over 30 years. You have no claim to them, no right to manage them, and no standing to make demands about how I handle my own affairs." "Look," Derek said, his voice shifting to the wheedling tone he'd used as a child when he wanted something. "I know I've made some mistakes in how I've approached this, but Margaret, you have to understand that I'm facing complete financial ruin. Here, everything I've worked for my entire career is about to disappear because I believed you'd be reasonable about helping family." The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. Derek had built financial commitments based on his assumption that he could intimidate or manipulate me into surrendering control of my assets. And now he was blaming me for his impending collapse because I refused to validate his presumptions. "That sounds like a problem you created for yourself," I replied. "I never promised you access to my money, never agreed to any management arrangement, and never gave you permission to make financial commitments based on expectations about my estate." Derek was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a cold edge that I'd never heard before. "Margaret, I really hoped we could resolve this amicably, but if you force me to take legal action to protect your interests and mine, I will. I've consulted with attorneys who specialize in elder law, and they've assured me that there are options for family members who are concerned about cognitive decline in elderly relatives." The threat was explicit now. Derek was prepared to have me declared mentally incompetent if I continued to refuse his demands for control over my assets. It was exactly the escalation that Elena had predicted, the desperate move of someone who had run out of reasonable options. "Derek," I said, my voice taking on the same cold tone he'd used, "if you attempt to challenge my competence in court, you will discover exactly how expensive and professionally damaging such a challenge can be. I suggest you reconsider very carefully before taking that step." "We'll see about that," Derek replied, and the line went dead. I sat in my kitchen for several minutes after the call ended, watching the morning light strengthen outside my windows and considering the implications of Derek's threat. He was clearly desperate enough to pursue legal action that would expose both of us to public scrutiny and potentially devastating financial costs. But desperation also made him vulnerable to the kind of strategic response I'd been preparing with Elena and David's help. I called Elena immediately, reaching her before she'd arrived at her office, but knowing she would want to know about Derek's escalation as soon as possible. "Margaret," Elena said when she answered, "what's happened?" I described the morning's phone call, Derek's announced intention to visit my home uninvited, and his explicit threat to pursue legal action challenging my competence. Elena listened without interruption, and I could hear her taking notes as I spoke. "This is actually excellent news," Elena said when I finished. "Derek has just made several critical mistakes that will work strongly in our favor if this goes to court." She explained that Derek's threat to challenge my competence immediately after I refused his demands for access to my assets would be seen by any judge as evidence of his self-interested motivation, rather than genuine concern for my welfare. His admission that his business was collapsing because of my refusal to provide him with money would undermine any claims that his actions were based on my best interests. "More importantly," Elena continued, "Derek has given us grounds for an immediate restraining order based on his harassment and threats. If he shows up at your house today despite your clear refusal to meet with him, we can have him arrested for trespassing and harassment." Elena's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of waiting for Derek to file his challenge to my competence, we would take the offensive by documenting his harassment, his financial desperation, and his obvious self-interest in gaining control of my assets. By the time Derek's legal team could organize their assault on my autonomy, we would have already established a comprehensive record of his inappropriate behavior and ulterior motives. "Don't answer the door when he arrives," Elena instructed. "Call the police if he refuses to leave your property, and document everything he says or does. We want a clear record of his escalating harassment for the restraining order hearing." I spent the morning preparing for Derek's arrival with the Same methodical attention to detail that had served me well throughout my business career. I set up my phone to record any conversations that might take place, positioned myself where I could observe my front entrance without being easily seen, and reviewed the comprehensive documentation Elena had prepared about Derek's financial situation and recent behavior. Derek's car pulled into my driveway at exactly 10 o'clock. A leased BMW that Marcus's investigation had revealed was 3 months behind on payments. Elena's presentation of my case was comprehensive and compelling. She began with testimony from Dr. Patricia Williams, the geriatrician who had evaluated my cognitive function just weeks earlier, confirming that my mental abilities were excellent for someone of any age. David Chen testified about the sophistication and success of my investment strategy, emphasizing that my recent decisions demonstrated clear strategic thinking rather than impaired judgment. The most powerful testimony came from the business owners I had supported over the years, people whose lives had been changed by my willingness to invest in their dreams when traditional lenders had turned them away. They spoke about my careful evaluation of their business plans, my ongoing involvement in their operations, and the positive impact my investments had made on both their individual success and the broader Milwaukee community. When Elena called me to testify on my own behalf, I spoke clearly and confidently about my investment philosophy, my business operations, and my reasons for refusing Derek's demands for control over my affairs. I explained that my decisions were based on 30 years of successful experience, comprehensive professional advice, and a clear understanding of my own goals and values. Judge Morrison's questions were probing but respectful, clearly designed to assess my competence rather than trap me in contradictions. I answered each question thoroughly and precisely, demonstrating the kind of organized thinking and clear communication that directly contradicted Derek's claims about my declining abilities. After both sides had presented their cases, Judge Morrison took a brief recess to review the evidence before delivering her ruling. When court reconvened, her decision was unambiguous and decisive. This court finds no evidence whatsoever that Mrs. Carlisle suffers from any cognitive impairment or inability to manage her own affairs, Judge Morrison stated. To the contrary, the evidence demonstrates that Mrs. Carlisle possesses exceptional business acumen and has successfully managed complex financial holdings for decades. Judge Morrison continued, "Furthermore, this court finds that Mr. Carlisle's petition is motivated not by concern for his stepmother's welfare, but by his own financial desperation and his desire to access assets that do not belong to him. His conduct toward Mrs. Carlisle constitutes harassment and attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person." The judge's final ruling was devastating for Derek. Not only did she dismiss his guardianship petition with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled, but she also granted Elena's request for a permanent restraining order prohibiting Derek from any future contact with me or my business associates. Most significantly, Judge Morrison ordered Derek to pay all legal costs associated with defending against his frivolous petition, a sum that Elena later calculated at nearly $200,000. For someone already facing financial ruin, this additional burden would accelerate his path to bankruptcy. As we left the courthouse that afternoon, Elena smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had achieved a complete victory. "Margaret," she said, "Derek just learned a very expensive lesson about the difference between being old and being vulnerable." The aftermath of the court hearing unfolded with the inevitable logic of Derek's own poor decisions. Within 2 weeks, news of his failed guardianship petition and the resulting financial penalties had spread through Chicago's financial services community, destroying what remained of his professional reputation. Several clients withdrew their accounts, citing concerns about his judgment and ethics. Derek's financial consulting firm collapsed entirely within a month, unable to survive the loss of clients and the regulatory scrutiny triggered by his legal troubles. Marcus Thompson's investigation revealed that Derek filed for personal bankruptcy 6 weeks after the hearing, listing debts that exceeded his assets by more than $4 million. Patricia divorced Derek before his bankruptcy filing was complete, apparently having concluded that her financial future was better protected by ending their marriage than by supporting him through his self-created crisis. The divorce proceedings revealed that she had been quietly transferring assets into her own name for months, suggesting that she had anticipated Derek's collapse long before it became public. 6 months after the courthouse victory, I sat in Thomas's reading chair watching the sunset paint the Milwaukee sky in shades of purple and gold. The orchard we had planted together was beginning to bloom with the promise of another successful harvest, and the business empire we had built continued to thrive under my careful management. Derek's prediction that I was already in my grave had proven to be spectacularly wrong. Instead of declining into helpless dependency, I had discovered reserves of strength and strategic thinking that had been dormant during the comfortable years of my marriage to Thomas. The challenge Derek presented had awakened something fierce and competent in me, something that honored the partnership Thomas and I had shared while proving that I was fully capable of protecting what we had built together. The irony was perfect in its completeness. Derek's attempt to bury my autonomy had instead buried his own financial future, destroying everything he had claimed to be protecting while demonstrating to everyone who mattered that his assumptions about my declining capabilities had been not just wrong but dangerously naive. Some people mistake age for weakness, widowhood for vulnerability, and kindness for stupidity. Derek had made all of those mistakes, and the cost of his errors had been everything he thought he was entitled to inherit. In trying to put me in my grave, he had dug his own. The house felt peaceful now, filled with the satisfaction of justice served and challenges overcome. Tomorrow would bring new investment opportunities, new business partnerships, and new ways to use the empire Thomas and I had built to create value for the community that had supported us for so long. Derek had been right about one thing. There had been a burial, but it was his financial future that lay 6 feet under, while I remained very much alive and completely in control of my own destiny. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. He sat in the car for several minutes, apparently making phone calls, before finally emerging and walking to my front door with the determined stride of someone who had convinced himself that intimidation would succeed where manipulation had failed. The doorbell rang twice before Derek began knocking with increasing force. "Margaret," he called through the door. "I know you're in there. We need to talk about this situation before it gets completely out of hand." I remained silent, watching through my living room window as Derek's frustration mounted. After 5 minutes of unsuccessful attempts to get my attention, he pulled out his phone and called my number. "Margaret," he said when I answered, "stop playing games and open the door. I've driven all the way up here to help you understand the seriousness of your situation." "Derek," I replied calmly, "I told you I wouldn't meet with you. You're trespassing on my property, and I want you to leave immediately." "I'm not leaving until we resolve this," Derek said, his voice rising with anger. "You're being completely unreasonable, and your stubbornness is destroying my life, and probably yours too." Derek, I'm calling the police if you don't leave my property in the next 60 seconds. "Go ahead and call them," Derek shouted, apparently believing that his desperation gave him some kind of moral authority to ignore my clearly stated boundaries. "When they get here, I'll explain that I'm trying to help an elderly woman who's clearly not capable of making rational decisions about her own welfare." The arrogance was stunning. Derek actually believed that police officers would side with him against a homeowner who was asking an unwelcome visitor to leave her property. His desperation had apparently impaired his judgment to the point where he couldn't recognize how his behavior would appear to neutral observers. I called 911 and reported that someone was trespassing on my property and refusing to leave, despite being asked repeatedly to do so. The dispatcher was professional and efficient, promising that officers would arrive within 10 minutes to address the situation. Derek continued his angry monologue through my front door, alternating between threats about legal action and pleading appeals to my sympathy for his financial predicament. His words became increasingly irrational as his frustration mounted, providing excellent material for the recording I was making of the entire encounter. The police arrived exactly when promised, 2 officers who approached the situation with the calm professionalism of people who dealt with family disputes regularly. I watched through my window as they spoke with Derek, who immediately launched into an explanation about his concerns for my mental health and his family obligation to protect my interests. One of the officers knocked on my door and identified himself, asking if I was willing to speak with them about the situation. I opened the door and invited them inside, offering coffee while I explained that Derek was my stepson who had been harassing me and my business associates for weeks in an attempt to gain control of my financial affairs. The officers were respectful, but thorough in their questions, clearly trying to assess whether Derek's claims about my mental state had any validity. I provided them with Elena's business card, explained that I had comprehensive legal and financial representation, and answered their questions about my living situation and daily activities with the clarity and detail that demonstrated my obvious competence. After 20 minutes of conversation, the senior officer nodded with satisfaction. "Mrs. Carlisle, you clearly don't need any assistance managing your affairs. We're going to ask your stepson to leave your property and advise him that any future, unwelcome contact could result in harassment charges." I watched from my living room window as the officers spoke with Derek again, their body language making it clear that they were delivering an ultimatum rather than a request. Derek's face went through several emotional transitions as he realized that his desperate gambit had not only failed, but had actually created legal problems for him. Derek left without another word, but not before shooting a venomous glare toward my house that revealed the depth of his anger and frustration. His desperate attempt to intimidate me into submission had backfired spectacularly, providing additional evidence of his harassment while demonstrating to neutral observers that his claims about my incompetence were obviously false. Elena filed for the restraining order that afternoon, supported by comprehensive documentation of Derek's escalating harassment, his financial desperation, and his explicit threats to challenge my competence for his own benefit. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, giving us time to prepare a presentation that would establish clear legal boundaries around Derek's future conduct. But Derek's legal team moved faster than we anticipated. 3 days after the trespassing incident, I received notice that Derek had filed a petition seeking guardianship over my person and estate, claiming that I was suffering from age-related cognitive decline that made me vulnerable to financial exploitation and poor decision-making. The petition was professionally prepared and strategically crafted, focusing on my age, my recent widowhood, and what Derek's attorneys characterized as questionable investment decisions that demonstrated impaired judgment. They had clearly done their homework, identifying specific transactions that could be portrayed as risky or emotionally motivated rather than financially sound. Elena's response was swift and devastating. Within 48 hours, she had filed a comprehensive motion to dismiss Derek's petition, supported by medical records documenting my excellent cognitive function, financial records demonstrating the consistent success of my investment strategy, and detailed documentation of Derek's financial crisis and self-interested motivation for seeking control of my assets. The centerpiece of Elena's filing was Marcus Thompson's complete investigation into Derek's financial situation, which revealed the full scope of his desperation and the extent to which he had marketed his expected access to my assets as collateral for his business ventures. The documentation showed that Derek's petition was not motivated by concern for my welfare, but by his need to access my money to avoid personal and professional bankruptcy. Elena also included affidavits from my business associates, friends, and professional contacts, attesting to my competence and the obvious success of my financial management. The contrast between Derek's claims about my declining abilities and the unanimous testimony of people who worked with me regularly was stark and compelling. The guardianship hearing took place in a downtown courthouse where I had appeared years earlier for property closings and business disputes. but never as the subject of proceedings that would determine my fundamental right to control my own life. Elena had prepared me thoroughly for the questions I would face and the tactics Derek's attorneys might use to undermine my credibility. Derek sat across the courtroom with his legal team, his expression alternating between false concern and barely concealed anger. Patricia was notably absent, having apparently decided that associating herself publicly with Derek's campaign against my autonomy was too risky for her own reputation. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named Sandra Morrison, whose reputation for fairness and intolerance for frivolous litigation had made her one of the most respected jurists in Milwaukee County. Judge Morrison reviewed the competing filings with careful attention before calling the hearing to order. Derek's attorney opened with a presentation that portrayed me as a vulnerable elderly woman whose recent widowhood had left her susceptible to poor judgment and potential exploitation. They emphasized my age, the complexity of my financial holdings, and what they characterized as increasingly risky investment decisions that demonstrated declining cognitive function. When the attorney finished his opening statement, Judge Morrison asked Derek to take the witness stand and explain his specific concerns about my competence. Derek's testimony was carefully rehearsed but fundamentally unconvincing, focusing on vague claims about my stubbornness and emotional decision-making, rather than concrete evidence of impaired judgment. Under Elena's cross-examination, Derek's motivations became painfully clear. Elena methodically established his financial desperation, his marketing of expected inheritance money to business partners, and his obvious self-interest in gaining control of my assets. By the time she finished questioning him, Derek's claims about protecting my welfare had been thoroughly discredited.